Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few moments.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Craig Piercy, and I am the CEO of the American Nuclear Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to another installment of State of Nuclear, which is our periodic webinar series where we explore current events with an eye toward their impact on the future of technology and the community of professionals that make it a reality. As a reminder, our next episode of this series will be held live during the ANS annual meeting in Chicago. That's 1 p.m. Central Time, Monday, June 16th at the Chicago Marriott downtown. To register, go to ans.org/annual. Today, I'm dispensing with our usual front matter. Dan, please throw the notes in the chat so we can dive right in. And let me start by welcoming today's guests. First, the Senior VP of Policy for the Nuclear Energy Institute, John Kotek. The Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, Judy Greenwald. President and CEO of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council, Todd Aberjano. And finally, Global Energy Practice Leader at the international law firm Hogan Lovells, Amy Roma. Welcome, everybody. So we live in Dickensian times. We've got a new administration. It's running fast. It's breaking things, but it's also placed a clear priority on advancing nuclear technology. If you look at the letter that President Trump sent his newly minted director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy as science advisor, he quoted 3 priorities in his letter: AI, quantum, and nuclear technology. Now, to be fair, no administration gets a perfect score. It's always a mixed bag. And, we hear talk of DOGE and people leaving the administration. But again, you sort of have the good and the bad. And I think that, the good and the bad today maybe seems a little bit starker than it has in the past. And I know a lot of our members are still trying to make sense of it all. So the State of Nuclear is kind of meant to be a wide angle view of the nuclear landscape. We don't really dive deep into technology here, but it's a check-in of sorts. And it's like, when you see an old friend and you really kind of pull them aside and say, hey, how you doing? And so part of this today is talking about how's nuclear doing. And so Todd, I'm gonna start with you. How are we doing?
Well, thanks, Craig, first of all, for having me join your panel today. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. How are we doing? Well, if I think back to the last time that I served on this panel with you a couple of years ago, I think we're doing quite well. As I sort of go down the list of things that have progressed over the last couple of years since we last did this, if you look, across not only the U.S. but across the globe, projects are now starting to be developed. We've got a couple of projects here in the U.S. through the ARDP program that are now currently underway. TerraPower broke ground in Kemmerer, Wyoming last year. X Energy is working with Dow down in Texas. So, we've actually got projects being developed, and obviously on the international front, Westinghouse has got great things going on in Poland right now. So from a project development standpoint, I think we're headed in the right direction. If you look at fuel, Piketon, Ohio, Centrus has got their plant up and running. They're producing some HALEU at this point, obviously not enough to meet the growing demand, but I have a good feeling that we're going to continue to see improvements on the HALEU front, and we will certainly continue to develop domestic production on that front. If you asked me this 2 years ago in terms of financing, I think we would have been in a much different position than we are today. I think we're starting to see private capital come in even more than it has before. If you look just last week, just last Friday, the development committee for the World Bank said that, hey, we should probably start financing nuclear projects, which is a huge change for not only the World Bank, but I think also for a lot of the other multilateral development banks across the world. I think they take their cues from the World Bank, and I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see some positive movement on the MDB front for project development overseas. So, lots of good things happening. I think the industry overall is on an upward trajectory and has been for the last 7 or 8 years. But I think we're starting to see that curve get a little bit more exponential at this point, and I'm feeling pretty good about where we are.
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Todd. All right, Judy, I want to come to you. How are we doing?
So there's a lot of promise and a lot of challenges. As most of you know, we work at the NIA on helping to create the conditions for success for new nuclear energy so it can play a major role as an energy security and climate solution. And those conditions for success are competitive cost, getting to market, public acceptance, and scaling. And we need demos and early mover projects this decade, and then big scale up to a commercial scale and lots of nuclear energy in the 2030s and beyond. And we are making good progress on these early mover projects, which are sort of necessary but not sufficient to go really big, but we do have to get through that stage. And the sort of secret sauce of the way we do energy innovation and commercialization in the United States is that it's private sector led and government enabled. So you need both a really strong role from the government, most importantly in the beginning, and then the government sort of backs off as industry takes on a greater and greater role. But we don't do sort of state-owned enterprise. We have the federal policies that we do, and state policies enable the private sector to do its thing and do the innovation. And so we need a lot of policies in place, and then we have to make sure that they're sustained for long enough to get to the point where we get what I think some might refer to as commercial liftoff. And I think we're coming in to this quarter, I guess, that's now the last quarter. We're coming in from last year with a lot of momentum on the policy front as well as the commercial front. And the key is to sustain that and make sure that we do the thing we do, which is that we can really lead the world in innovation as well as innovative policy that enables the private sector to be competitive and scale.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. All right, John, I feel like I've asked you this question many times over the decades that I've known you. How are we doing?
Yeah, I think we're doing well. I think Todd and Judy both made some excellent points, so I won't repeat those. I think we continue to enjoy the bipartisan support that all of us on this call and far beyond have worked so hard to achieve over the past decade. I think it's heartening to hear things like what Secretary Wright was quoted as saying this morning, where he was talking about trying to get the conditions right to not do onesies, twosies, but to get to, I think he said 5, 7, 8, 10, 20 new nuclear plants built. I think that's where we got to be. I think we got to get to order books. I think things like the ARDP projects, the Gen 3 plus SMR, those are really important steps along the path to getting where we ultimately need to be, which is a next wave of widespread, nuclear construction at scale. And whether it's, doubling U.S. nuclear, tripling U.S. nuclear, we all know there needs to be a lot more. Fortunately, a lot of this started with customers starting to really recognize the value of nuclear as a firm, clean resource. Well, increasingly we're seeing policymakers at state and federal level recognizing that and figuring out ways to value it. I think it was Todd who mentioned the finance community as well. We've got a lot of really smart people working on this issue, trying to figure out how we get to that wave of new nuclear construction here in the U.S. And so I don't know exactly what the solution set is going to look like, but I think we're going to find our way there. And I think in the not too distant future, we're going to be looking down looking at an order book that's sufficient to build the supply chain, the workforce, and the other things we need to do to be successful.
Yeah, thanks, John. All right, Amy, we've covered a lot of ground, but how are we doing?
I think we're doing well. I think a lot of the other folks, I won't repeat what they said, but kind of are telling a storyline. There's a lot of activity in a lot of different directions. We saw X Energy submit their construction or permit application with Dow just a few weeks ago. TerraPower submitted theirs, a long time before. There's a wave of new reactor applications. I believe TVA is working on their reactor application for the GE Hitachi plant for Clinch River site. The Darlington site's moving forward. You saw probably everybody saw the announcement in Poland with the AP 1000 work that came out. I think that was yesterday or earlier this morning. Lot of activity going on. The love affair between AI data centers and nuclear continues. And so I think we're seeing a lot more things happen behind the scenes that are going to come out into kind of public announcements in the near term. We're seeing the DOE RFP for data centers come out. We're seeing the RFP for the 900 million for Gen 3 Plus got reissued. I think reissued, so it could probably be packaged with data centers, and people could maybe think about maybe disrupting a little bit more of what the model was that they were offering. We're seeing a number of non-utilities continue to emerge as the people who are going to be the first owners or the first builders of projects, which is something that I think a lot of us maybe didn't anticipate just a few years ago. And we're seeing utilities think about what they see their role being and what role that they want to play. So there are some who are standing by the wayside, just kind of watching things. There are some who are trying to figure out, do we want to be the operator here? And there are some who say, do we want to get into the mix? And what role do we have there? On the front end, if we're the owner during construction and developing the project, do we do that alone, or do we do that with other folks as well to de-risk it? Some of the off-takers, maybe some of the finance community as well. So I think we're seeing a lot of things happen, and I think we're seeing a lot of people try to figure out how can we deliver these projects on the timelines that we need to deliver them on. And getting a spade in the ground and building your first of a kind is the absolute first necessary step we need to in order to kind of like make this a reality. But there's a lot of other things going on too to say, how do we leverage this momentum in order to deliver, like John said, a book of projects.
Right. So a follow-up question, and somewhat related to that, and really it's for anybody in the group. But if we were having this conversation 3 years ago, the conversation would have centered around climate change and decarbonization and nuclear's role in that, and the sort of the nuclear imperative in that existential challenge. Fast forward 3 years. It sort of seems like, at least from a policy standpoint, we're on a lunch break when it comes to decarbonization policy, and data centers is the issue of data center energy demand is really kind of, in a way, neatly replaced climate change as sort of the nuclear the driver for the nuclear imperative. But then you talk to people and you read articles and it says, well, there's probably not as much demand because all the data centers are going around to every jurisdiction, shopping the same project, and everybody's writing down, how much energy and megawatts they need for their system. And so there's some counting, and then there's going to be more in the way of efficiency. We're sort of 2 years into this epiphany about data centers. How durable do you think this is? I mean, is it here and here to stay, or is there something that could sort of fundamentally change the landscape that no longer makes that the prime driver? I'll open it up, whoever's ready.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Craig. I do think it's durable. I think the numbers you're seeing are probably higher than the real demand, but that doesn't change the fact that the numbers you're seeing now are like 5 times what they were just 2 years ago in terms of anticipated capacity growth needed over the next 5 years. So, sure, even if there is some kind of fudge in there, I still think there is a tremendous amount of demand growth. And of course, that's not the only driver. right? If you look at the recent grid strategies reports, they point to AI, but also broader data center demand, building electrification, transportation electrification. There are a lot of other drivers. To your point about carbon, first of all, I think the fact that nuclear is both firm and zero carbon is part of what's driving the data center folks to want to turn to us. I do think it's an and. I mean, so you look at places like Texas that are looking at potentially really large state level investments in nuclear. Maybe that's less about carbon than it is about firm, and reliability. But I don't think it hurts nuclear to be zero carbon. I was in another state fairly recently, won't name which one, where the Republican governors, representatives were talking about their interest in nuclear, and they didn't shy away at all from talking about zero carbon because that's what their customers want. They've got a lot of industrial load. The industrial load is saying we need low carbon if we're going to go compete in European markets, for example. And so they didn't bat an eye about touting that as one of the attributes alongside reliability, resilience, stable cost, et cetera. Enough for me.
I pile on a bit. I think the sort of the fun thing about working on nuclear energy is that there's so many benefits and different people prioritize different benefits. I think, broadly, and this isn't true across the board, maybe Republicans are more interested in the reliability and the firm side of the benefits, and Democrats have been more interested in the climate benefits, although there is overlap there. Maybe some countries now are more interested in the climate benefits, others more interested in the security benefits. But the fact is you get both with nuclear, and you also get some other really important benefits, which is that nuclear energy is very energy dense. So you don't need a lot of land to make a lot of energy. So you can actually build out a system that you need to build out and make much bigger to serve a growing demand on much less of a land footprint. And that really helps because, not everyone wants energy facilities near them. And if you have a smaller footprint, you can actually get a lot more energy for a smaller amount of land. And I think that's a huge benefit. You also can locate more conveniently to transmission lines. There's just a lot of reasons why nuclear energy is a good solution on multiple fronts, and then different people kind of favor different aspects of it. And I think that's why we are where we are now with the set of policies that we have put in place that I hope we can sustain, that have been put in place on a bipartisan basis, because it was a set of policies that folks could agree on for a range of reasons, and not everyone had the same set of reasons.
Yeah. So less filling tastes great, right? Like it's, the benefits are appeal to everyone. Anybody else want to get into this?
Just I think if you look at sort of the change here in the U.S. on a policy standpoint with the current Trump administration, there's going to be less focus on decarbonization from a U.S. federal policy perspective. But the U.S. is just one of nearly 200 countries across the world that are concerned about these sorts of things, and I'm not seeing a mad rush from other countries to lessen their decarbonization goals and efforts. And so I think we're going to continue to see decarbonization continue to be, sort of high up on the scale, is why, not just industries here in the US, but across the globe are going to be interested in bringing nuclear online. I think the other point is for, other countries, it's still a national security issue for them. And so, building nuclear, the countries that you're looking at now that have made, a positive outreach toward the nuclear industry are countries that are highly concerned about their energy security and their national security. And I think that's a big reason why they're moving into the nuclear space as well.
Amy?
Yeah, and I would just add that I think a lot of times there's a difference between what you see as forward-facing arguments that people make and then what their internal discussions are. When you're looking at long-term planning, when you're a company, you've got to figure out, hey, where do I think things are going to be 5-10 years from now, especially if you're going to make an investment into something like nuclear, right, which is a long-term investment. And I think a lot of companies are saying, okay, we may have a pause in what that transition is going to be, but they anticipate that it will be taken up again. And it's certainly something that other countries are moving forward in, with Europe being particularly aggressive. And so it's an element of does it even matter for like what we say forward facing, because nuclear is so adaptable? You can say, I need power. I mean, at the end of the day, data centers need immense amount of reliable power, and they need hugely reliable power. And so, and if they can't connect into a local grid and are expected to bring their own data source, energy source, which is where kind of we're increasingly going, as you see more and more data centers added that are going to put stress on the grid. And you're seeing more and more states come up and say, hold on, we're going to have to take a look at that. And you're seeing FERC weigh into it and others as well. It's just a matter of, what is it that gets you where you need to go? And nobody plans on building a nuclear power plant and having it provide power in the next year. It's going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. What do you need, and how do you get that?
And I heard, so I was in a state that I won't name, and I heard a discussion about a tech company whose name everyone knows, and they were going through a siting process in the Midwest, and it seemed like their thinking was, hey, even if I put my data center right next to one of those old coal 200 to 300 megawatt coal plants that are in the in the MISO grid, I know it may impact my carbon intensity score of the energy from that I use for my data centers, but I know that that's a place where a small modular reactor can go relatively easily, and that I can expect at some point in the future, and probably even support the the sort of the coal to nuclear transition. So it does seem like it's real. It seems like it's enduring, and it's sort of added to the value proposition of nuclear overall. So I want to change gears and kind of go to some of the big issues that are facing the administration and Congress right now. Obviously, there are a whole host of legislative processes that have started, including the reconciliation process, which just it allows Congress to get big things done, where you don't need 60 votes in the Senate, but you've also got to pay, you've got to pay for everything that you spend, right? So if the Republicans want to extend the tax credits that were, or the tax cuts that were enacted in 2017, they need to find offsetting spending cuts, I guess. The parliamentarian will tell us. But what is that? How is that discussion, and especially about the IRA tax credits for both new and existing nuclear that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act, how is that discussion kind of shaping up on Capitol Hill right now? John, I'm going to go to you because I know you've been paying close attention to it. What are you seeing?
Well, we're seeing that policymakers are recognizing the value of retaining what's in the existing tax code. Great example, the tax credit for current nuclear generation. Folks may have seen that Excel up in Minnesota has filed with their PUC to hand more than 300 million back to the ratepayers, right? Rebate, and 176 million of that is owing to the existence of the 45U credit for existing plants. I think the numbers across the Duke fleet in North and South Carolina are on the order of $500 million. I mean, the president has made no bones about his desire to slash Americans' energy costs, and that policy is doing it right now. Mm-hmm. All right, so I think policymakers get that, and I think that's why you're seeing multiple, both House and Senate members signing on to letters to leadership. And I'm talking about Republican members signing on to letters to leadership saying, "Hey, these policies are important. We should keep them in place." When it comes to the credits for new generation, I think, again, people recognize, frankly, the reason we're having this conversation about new build is because we finally got nuclear treated on par with wind and solar, when it comes to the tax code. And, you look at how long take wind, for example, right? I think the first emergence of that tax credit for wind generation came out of the Energy Policy Act of '92. Right, it was more than 15 years later before you saw wind really take off in the U.S., and it's because we had things like the policies in the Recovery Act that really provided an accelerant. Right, I think the conversation we're having in Congress is more around, you got to keep what you got, and you got to look at an accelerant to get the industry really jump started. And that's where things like the ARC Act come in, and we can go into that more later, but that's the Accelerating Reliable Capacity Act that Senator Risch has introduced. Not law yet, but would be a big help. But you know, the success of that legislation depends on keeping the credits that we have. It also depends on keeping the loan programs office. I mean, one, the law would use the LPO as the way to provide the cost overrun insurance that the Act provides, but also just the availability of low cost financing really matters when it comes to capital intensive projects like nuclear. And as we know, as borrowing rates have gone up, it's made projects like ours, look more pricey, and we're gonna need a resource like LPO to enable projects to go forward and achieve that order book I talked about. So I think folks on the Hill, have accepted and I think acknowledge those arguments, and so I'm cautiously optimistic. Craig, I guess is how I'd put it, but we're certainly not counting our chicken.
Yeah. So Amy, I have to imagine that your phone is probably ringing off the hook with clients saying, what's going on? How do I, what's the environment look like 2 years from now? What's your take on just all of the I mean, that we heard IRA tax credits, we heard loan program office. We didn't yet talk about ARDP yet, but that's, there's a need for funding there. What's your overall take on this and where it's going?
Well, the biggest fear that I see is people are afraid that the tax credits are going to go away, and that all the nice spreadsheets that they made modeling them out are going to fundamentally change the project they were planning on investing in. And so that's something that I'm getting a lot of phone calls about, and looping in our lobbyists to kind of advise on that end. And so far, it's kind of, you have to wait and see. You've got to watch what the appetite is. There's this expectation that there's a lot of Republicans that benefit from the tax credits from projects that are in their state. And so the anticipation is that these projects will continue. On the LPO side, I think there's is it going to remain available? Is it going to be remain available for nuclear projects? And are there going to be people there who can process the applications and approve them? So that's the concern on the LPO side. There's a lot of uncertainty being created by the executive orders. I feel like at the beginning of kind of this journey with the new administration, I was giving a lot of people talks about checks and balances and how they work, and what the different branches of government are and how they work, and how they only work that way if people continue to accept that they work that way, right? And so one of the things that we're seeing is a bunch of executive orders come out that impact independent agencies, including the NRC. And so people see an EO come out that says the NRC has to get rid of a whole bunch of regulations, and they're like, what does that mean for me? And I'm like, well, hold on. Then I'm trying to explain how the executive branch doesn't really have jurisdiction over independent agencies based on case law, but that's 1935 case law. So the Supreme Court opened the door that they do, and the president sure as heck is trying, including the ability to remove commissioners of independent agencies, or people that were appointed and approved by Congress that can only be removed for cause under the law. We're actually seeing people being removed from their positions without cause, and so that creates uncertainty likely for our Democratic commissioners. And so there's just a lot of moving parts in a lot of different directions. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for maybe false hope that something happened and therefore everything's going to change. I think that, and then I know you probably want to talk about this later, but there's the Texas lawsuits, there's right? And there's
we're going to go into regulations soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to flag, right, one of the Texas lawsuits is I call it the Last Energy case, just because it distinguishes it from the spent fuel case, but it involves Last Energy, Deep Fission, Valor, the state of Utah, the state of Arizona, Louisiana, Florida, and Texas. And they're challenging the NRC's ability to license advanced reactors. It's a little unclear as to what bounding parameters they're using, but certainly including microreactors within that. So I'm traveling probably to a lot of the same states you are, and I was just in Texas last week, and a lot of the questions I got from the audience was do we now have jurisdiction to license reactors. And I was like, well, no, I actually don't think that's how that case works. You still have the use of special nuclear material. It's just the fusion argument in reverse. It just kicks you over to Part 70 instead of Part 50, even if the NRC did a rulemaking and said a utilization facility doesn't include these type of microreactors, even if all that happened. But it throws uncertainty into the discussion. And right now, a lot of people are looking at writing some very big checks into a lot of different projects. And when you introduce regulatory uncertainty or what your path forward looks like, do you need to establish a whole new regulator, set up a whole new regulatory regime? When people start wondering about that, people start to put their pens down and ask a lot more questions. And I'm afraid that we're going to lose kind of some of the momentum that we've got moving forward.
Yeah, I do want to come back to that because I want to come back to the NRC and the role that it plays. But yeah, I've gotten to learn the term Humphrey's executor. I've never would have thought that would have come out of my mouth. But Judy, want to come to you. What are you seeing and on the sort of on the legislative priorities front? Like what's your top three? What are your genie wishes for this year?
Yeah, so our top, it's I think probably I can't get it down to three, but we put out a piece, I think it's called the Federal New Nuclear Investment Portfolio, which is the major victories that we've basically had legislatively over the past several years, including it started actually at the end of the last Trump administration. So these are bipartisan victories that have been put in place and we want to keep them. And it's the tax credits, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, the Loan Program Office, and the fuel availability program, and we really need them. And I should mention, there's not just one demonstration program, there's also a Gen 3 Plus demonstration program. So we need these pieces. And sort of getting back to what I said at the beginning about how we do this sort of thing, this innovation and commercialization in the US, we have these mix, the successful innovation and commercialization that's happened here in the energy sector comes from this mix of very strong policies that are portfolio policies. It's not just one thing, we need them all. Plus this private sector innovation and private sector aggressiveness and investment. And we need them both. And we can't really have one without the other, particularly these early stages when it's hard for any one entity to justify an early mover project. That we really need this action that's in the public interest where the government helps us get over that hump so that the private sector can really take off. And example I'd give is if you look at the natural gas industry, why is natural gas so competitive now? It's a lot of private sector initiative. It's also, there was a tax credit in 1980 that was called the unconventional gas tax credit, which gave incentives to extract unconventional natural gas, which is essentially fracking. And that unleashed a ton of private investment. We also had a lot of DOE and private sector research and development and demonstration on that front to sort of get the natural gas supply to where we now have it and to bring the cost down over time to where now that we don't need that kind of stimulus. It's embedded in competitive industries. And in parallel, we had natural gas turbines, which benefited a lot from innovation actually in aircraft turbines, a lot of which was Defense Department investment, as well as private sector innovation. So this is sort of how we do it. And we don't have to have the government in the whole way, but we do need them now. And we need them in a way that's smart and that leverages the private sector initiative and investment. And we really need these policies. And as John mentioned, we also need some additional ones, for example, in particular, a financial backstop for early mover projects. That's sort of one missing piece, but that only can build on all these other things because, as Amy says, people are counting on these to be able to make sure that their investments pencil out.
So Todd, I want to take what Judy just said, and she certainly, the broader, there's both a role for government and private industry. And I think as you've represented the nuclear supply chain here, there's been criticism, and I think some of it justifiable, on the business models that we've used in the past to build nuclear plants. But there also seems to be an acknowledgement of past mistakes and a real desire to change the way that we do business in nuclear to accomplish the outcome of having a healthy, new nuclear industry. what's your sense of how the industry, the business community in nuclear, how their thinking has evolved about, I mean, obviously we've gone from large to small, but how has their thinking evolved about avoiding some of the mistakes that we've made in the past?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Craig. And, I think from where I stand and from, the things that I hear from our members, we're really starting to see a shift in terms of, who's the buyer for the industry now. I mean, it's for decades, it's been utilities. But utilities aren't the ones who are being the first movers here with respect to new nuclear. It's, it's the industrial sector, it's hyperscalers, it's, companies that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think about nuclear energy. And so, we have to figure out from a policy standpoint what we can do from the U.S. government perspective to help those types of now buyers of nuclear get over the hump to really start putting order books together. And so, it's been mentioned by others on this call, but a financial backstop or cost overrun insurance is something that I've talked to a lot of financiers about over the last several months. And what I'm hearing from them is that if there were a way that the U.S. could put something like that together and not necessarily fund the entire thing, but fund a significant portion of it, that would be probably the one thing that could significantly open up the private sector capital pockets to really put big money into building new nuclear. I know that Tom Fanning has asked a question in the Q&A about, how do we speed up deployment? I think that's probably the best way we could do it. And so we've been having conversations with policymakers on, both on the Hill and in the executive branch about cost overrun insurance. And there is, I think, significantly more openness to those discussions in this administration than there was in the past. We talked about this with the Biden administration, and this was like a non-starter for them. So, President Trump is at heart a developer. He wants to build things. He's transactional, and everything that you see him do sort of leads to, how are we going to get stuff built? How are we going to become number one? And if he's looking at it from that perspective, I think that, the way we can do that is figure out how we're going to put the money that we do have available and do something like that.
All right, so let's move on to the next issue, because part of this, sort of to get back to Tom Fanning's question, well, what can we do to speed things up? Now, historically, a lot of the conversations surrounding that question has been focused on the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and updating and reforming the way that they license and regulate nuclear facilities to become more efficient and to not be a barrier to innovation and commercial scale up and so forth. Now, I happen to believe that a lot of times when people complain about the NRC, there's usually a secondary cause associated with it, right? Maybe they don't have the money or they don't have the engineering or something else. But obviously NRC, continues to work toward improving and transforming the way that they operate. Judy, let me start with you. We've heard a lot of good things said by NRC commissioners of both parties about moving forward. How do you measure our progress in that area? And are we close to the point where we can say, okay, we are the gold standard. It's not going to, we're not going to turn it around in 2 weeks, but we've wrung a fair amount of efficiency out of this, and we can set some predictable timeframes that are acceptable to industry. Where do you think we are on that?
I think we're going in a good direction, but I think it is still a work in progress. For example, the Advance Act that was enacted last summer asks NRC to do a whole bunch of things to become more efficient and effective at its job, and it's working through the system now. And we're seeing a lot of work that NRC is doing to be responsive to that direction from Congress. It actually started before that, and NRC has been working to become more efficient and effective at its job. And we think that's exactly what should happen. We at NIA, that we need an NRC, we need an effective NRC, we need efficiency to be a high priority for them, that it's actually urgent that we actually are able to license and build new nuclear energy for a lot of public benefit reasons, including reliability, climate, et cetera. So we think efficiency is actually something that's important to everybody. We think about it in 3 timescales. The first is near term. And what's happening in the near term is essentially one-off regulatory innovation, where kind of a bunch of brave early movers who are both early movers on the business and technology side, as well as early movers on the licensing side, are coming to NRC with applications and making the case to NRC why their project is safe, their reactor is safe. And sometimes the rules that that NRC has in place don't exactly fit, because these are new designs and a lot of the rules evolve to be specific to more conventional designs. So this is a process of mutual education, making sure that the rules can be adapted to fit these technologies, and that these technology developers can make their case to the regulator that they're safe. And we're seeing a lot of progress on that front. It's going to be a little bit slow still, slower than some people would like, but these early mover engagements are actually going much better than they have in the past. We are seeing genuine progress. We're seeing deadlines being met early. So I really do see genuine progress. And then that progress will then benefit the later movers, who both NRC and the developers and the new nuclear guys will learn from that. The sort of second time scale is the midterm. And that's what this Part 53 regulation that we've all been working on for many years now. And that's a regulation that's designed more with new nuclear in mind. It's a more flexible overall approach. And it should, over time, make it much even simpler to actually regulate, or significantly simpler to regulate new nuclear energy. And then in the long run, we need what we refer to as high volume licensing, where we get standardization, and standardization is a process that's both going to happen commercially as well as on the licensing side, where we get more and more comfortable with a certain set of designs. We down select. It's unlikely that every design is going to win either in the marketplace or at NRC. And then once we down select to a few designs and we can replicate them, then both the building of them and potentially even the manufacturing of them, as we get into more modular types of technology, and therefore the licensing of them, can also become much more standardized. And we can get really fast at this. I think one of the things we run into in our space is that people are impatient to get to that late part where everything goes super fast. And we're going to have to go through those early phases to get there. But we can get there. It's just going to require work. And it's going to require work on both the part of the government and the private sector to get to the point where we can license things much more quickly.
Yeah, because I think the goal here is out of all the companies, and I think both Fission and Fusion, all the companies that we have that are developing technologies today, that some of them are going to be able to figure out how to make, it's sort of like an F-150 or a Honda Accord, right? Somebody is going to figure out the use case, the manufacturing capability, and the ability to kind of move these things through an assembly line. We're building one once a week or once a month. Amy, I want to come to you on this because, an old friend of mine that worked on the Vogtle project for Southern Company used to argue that it was like climbing a mountain, but when you got to the top, it wasn't a mountain, it was a plateau, and you could run. Right. And you could do a lot of them really quickly. Does the plateau analogy hold? Are you confident that there is a plateau up there on the other side, or what does it look like to you?
Yeah, so maybe just on the first point about kind of to mention the metrics that the NRC's already kind of moved from. I remember I was working on a medical isotope protection facility licensing. It was in pre-application licensing in like the 2010, 2012 timeframe. And we were looking at an 18 to 24 month review cycle for the NRC to review a construction permit application. And that blew my mind because I was also simultaneously doing COLAs, which were not in an 18 to 24 month review cycle. And I was like, you guys are so lucky that you're a research reactor, that you get NRC light, that they can do this so quickly. But I had this moment where I was like, well, hold on, they have to actually make the same safety findings. And yeah, you got NRC Light, you're 10 megawatts, and these are bigger facilities, but like I do feel like we have some movement there. But I give that, for example, to then point to the Dow application for the X Energy reactor that just went in, which requested a 24-month review cycle for their construction permit application for a first of a kind advanced reactor application for a very large facility, right? And it just goes to show you that needle can move. And granted, like the NRC is still doing a sufficiency review, and we'll see what their review schedule looks like, but they've done a ton of pre-application work as well. But it just shows you how far the needle can move and has moved in that time frame. And I think it's something that could be lost to people. I mean, we've also seen how quickly the Kairos applications were reviewed. Again, those were test reactor applications and how quickly they have moved. The one thing I would say is I spent a lot of time thinking about that nth of a kind licensing and like what that looks like. Like to your point, like we're at a plateau and we're just running. The thing is that it's important to make sure that our first of a kind projects are also not first of a kind in that they are so bespoke, you're not going to build it again. And then you're having to go redesign it for your second of a kind because you have a customer who's giving you specs that require you to do something entirely different than you've done before. And then your third of a kind is different. So you're not going to get there after one. Your NRC licensing review should go a lot faster. And I would love to see some really nice accelerated timelines for nth of a kind designs that are true nth of a kind, where you're fundamentally licensing the same thing over again. You know what the impact is on the environment, you know how it interacts, you know what its safety parameters are and whatnot. And I would love to see the NRC's reviews for those second of a kind facilities really focus on the deltas. What's different here that we haven't reviewed before? And there was a concept with the last round of COLAs called the reference COLA, where you submit your first of a kind application and you flag the parts of that application that are intended to be replicated across all future applications, because everybody's planning on doing a fleet. And I think there's no reason like that same concept can't be pulled forward. And so I think there's a lot of promise for not just streamlining deployment generally, but streamlining NRC licensing and then sharply reducing NRC licensing fees for and review schedules when you are truly at those kind of nth of a kind deployment levels. So I think that's your I'm at a plateau and I'm running analogy.
Yeah. John, I know NEI has done a lot of work in terms of, conceiving of other, ways where you know, licensing things with sort of a different perspective focused on rapid production. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we submitted last summer a proposal. We called it Regulations of Rapid High Volume Deployable Reactors. And the idea was to give the NRC a roadmap for how they could take what, under current approaches would be like a 5-year adventure to site a microreactor and get that down in the neighborhood of 6 months. Right. And, happy to say that, when we got a response back from the NRC, it wasn't you guys are crazy. There was, no fatal flaws identified. Certainly this work needs to be done, and you wouldn't expect to do that on the first of a kind. But going from years to months for some of these, types of technologies that you expect to be deployed, not in the onesies and twosies, but hundreds, ought to be achievable. And going back to Judy's comments, we are starting to see more receptivity to this type of thinking. Job's far from done, but feel like we're heading in a better direction.
Thanks, John. And then Todd, I want to get your comments on this. And I think, the other thing that I want to put out there is like, we are not acting alone. A lot of the conversation is talked about, domestic deployment of American technologies, but there's also the whole issue of international competition about, we've had several questions in the chat about China. They just fired up their molten salt reactor, right? Like they seem to be making significant progress. Feel free to jump in on the plateau and running, but also what does it mean for us internationally?
Yeah, well, I'll just start there because I think everybody else has kind of covered the other stuff. But, another part of the ADVANCE Act was to ensure that the NRC continues to work collaboratively with other regulators across the world. And I think that they've done that very well with Canada. They're also doing it now with the UK. But there are opportunities to continue those sorts of collaborations with other countries, and I think that they need to do that. I've spoken several times with Chairman Wright at the NRC about this very fact, and he is full bore behind making sure that that happens. So, in terms of just not just deploying here domestically, but exporting our products overseas. Yeah, China's a huge competitor. Russia's a huge competitor. We've got competitors in France and Korea as well. And if you look at all four of those competitors, they're all, for the most part, state-run operations, right? And we are not. So we have got to figure out a way to be much more competitive in the space. If the United States wants to be the dominant player in civil nuclear energy, we've got to figure that out. And so I think that this is a big part of what the Trump administration should certainly be focusing on over the next, 3+ years, is how can we make our civil nuclear industry competitive with the Chinas and the Russias. And obviously there's a big part of that question is geopolitical as well. Do we want Russia and China having 80 to 100-year relationships with countries that want to build nuclear, or do we want to have those relationships with them? And so, these are all considerations that I think from a policy standpoint, this current administration needs to be focused on. And I think they are looking at those things.
Yeah, good. So a couple of things about, I know we've got some questions in the chat, but I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier, Amy. We'll call it the last energy suit, even though there are other parties to it. I don't want to go down into it in detail, but obviously the discussion here is whether or not there's a state role for regulating nuclear energy facilities. For those of you for anybody that wants to jump in, is there anybody on the call that thinks that starting now to create a process that allows states to regulate whether it's the design or the operation or both of nuclear plants, is that going to save time, and is that going to make things happen more quickly?
Can I just jump in from my experience in the materials licensing space? I know that there's this mindset that people may have where they're like, if I go to states, they can be more flexible. And if I go to states, it's going to be less expensive. And in some cases, that's true, right? That it could be less expensive, it could go quicker. But having to develop a framework from scratch on how you regulate reactors is really hard and will take a long time. And then compounding having multiple licensing authorities so that you can't just, once you license something in Texas, you haven't licensed it in Massachusetts, or you don't know what New York will do. From my perspective, I'm actually seeing this, the differences between agreement states, which are states that have stepped into the authority of the NRC for byproduct materials and certain source materials. But I've seen it slowing down actually the deployment of radiopharmaceuticals. So rather than having radiopharmaceuticals just have, and they're largely based on the NRC's framework. Most agreement states have regulations very similar, but there's enough of a difference that in order for companies to assess how they deploy radiopharmaceuticals, they're doing a survey of every state and then the NRC, and it's taking huge amounts of time and effort and really unfortunate. I also want to just flag, as the nuclear lawyer here, is that the benefit of having a federal regulator that is all encompassing in their regulations in this space is that you get federal preemption. And so back when nuclear was first being deployed, a lot of states said, hey, I want to add additional safety requirements on top of what the federal regulator wanted to do, or I want to add additional requirements about spent fuel. And at the end of the day, we have like decades of case law that says the NRC entirely occupies this space and nobody else can. And so no Massachusetts, no New York, you can't come and add additional requirements on top of what the NRC requires. So you're losing the benefit of having one regulator who knows your technology, knows how to deploy it, that can benefit across like multiple licensing actions, but then you're losing all the protections that were afforded to you under all these years and years of case law. And so that's my fear. I know I've had a lot of conversations where people are like, well, how can we make it work? And so like some things that you could figure out are, can the state do the environmental reviews? Like, does it need to be the NRC that does the NEPA-esque review? Can the state do that? Can they step in there? What are the other areas that could help also streamline kind of licensing and deployment? That also recognizes that a state has an inherent interest in something that's built within its borders. And I think that there's other ways to work around it maybe than what that suit is trying to do.
So let me see if anybody else has a quick comment on this, because I've got a couple more questions on another issue I want to jump in, and we are kind of running short on time. So, but I wanted to give everybody else an opportunity. Any other hot takes on the last energy suit or state regulation of nuclear? All right. Several questions in the Q&A about tariffs, the impact of tariffs on U.S. competitiveness globally in the civil nuclear marketplace. And I think also the question of, is that going to make nuclear built in the U.S. more expensive? Does anybody want to take a crack at that?
Well, I can start. Certainly, Craig, as an industry, we're supportive of policies that are going to help create American jobs, protect national security, spur job creation. Obviously, you got to make sure those don't stand in the way of doing things like meeting our energy needs to supply the electricity needed to power AI, to meet another part of our national security imperatives. And so, I think we're certainly still analyzing what the impacts of the tariffs are and might be. Certainly, there's still quite a bit in flux. We're in this pause period. And so have to see what happens there. But I thought Todd made a really important point earlier about, at the end of the day, what we're hearing from this administration is they really do want to see things get built. And so, certainly to the extent that there's an argument to be made that, by finding ways to maybe mitigate the effects, of these policies, so that they allow things to move forward faster and more affordably in the U.S. I think that's the sort of conversation you'd be able to have. But Todd, you're in talking to folks too. I think you see it any different?
Well, no, I don't. And, just a couple of extra points, I suppose. I think I mentioned this to a few of you earlier with respect to, Trump tariffs. You just have to wait a couple of days and it's going to change again. You just, we don't know what we're getting at this point. Ultimately, whatever happens over the next several months or, year on tariffs, we'll just have to wait and see. But I will say this. I think when the president and his team look at certain industries in the U.S. that they want to make sure succeed, as Craig mentioned earlier, nuclear is one of them. And so I think there are opportunities with respect to the tariffs for exclusions and those sorts of things. Obviously the U.S. has a global supply chain. We do not have a 100% domestic supply chain to build nuclear power plants. And so we're going to need to continue to import things to do that. And with the president and his team recognizing the importance of the nuclear industry, I think that they may take a hard look at some exclusions for this industry with respect to the tariffs.
Thanks, Todd. All right, so we're coming down to it. A couple minutes left. I want to go to sort of our last issue, but I'm looking for hot takes, predictions, and really just things, maybe other considerations about nuclear that we haven't talked about today that people should be paying attention to. So let's see. Amy, I'm going to go to you first.
All right. So I think the big hot takes is watch this space between data centers and AIs, and that Gen 3 Plus RFP that's out there, and then the government kind of data centers on government land. I think we're going to see a lot of people coalescing around each other. A lot of projects will probably, also plan on relying on LPO, so we'll have to kind of see the developments there. We hadn't talked about it. I just want to note spaces getting pretty hot again. The administration is really kind of focused on figuring out like, hey, what are we going to do on Mars? You know, they're continuing to move forward on the projects on the moon. Big gap here is NRC for civilian space, commercial space projects. They've been able to work around it by having things be DOE and DoD kind of focused projects with Draco. But at some point, this is going to come to a head, but it's really exciting and interesting. And I'm getting more and more calls from space companies that are designing reactors intended to be deployed in space. So a lot of activities there. And then nuclear maritime is continuing to kind of see some movement forward on nuclear powered shipping, which is going to raise a whole host of issues. If you think nuclear law is complicated, try doing maritime law, like not it. So anyway, a lot of exciting things going on, a lot of interesting things going on. Those are my hot takes.
Thanks, Amy. All right, Judy, hot take.
So I think there's also a lot of exciting things going on. I'd pile on to Amy what the Defense Department is doing. There's a lot of interest among the services, particularly in microreactors. I think that's potentially exciting. We have a long history in our country of innovations coming out of DoD and them nurturing them. I do think that at least my answer to Tom Banning's question is how do we get things to move faster? And that's to implement well this set of policies that we all worked so hard together to get. This is on a bipartisan basis over many years. And if we can implement them well, if we have enough people to implement them inside the government, and if we have the right set of the right leadership, which I think we do. We didn't mention this either. We have some great leaders coming into this administration who are really pro-nuclear. We really need to make sure that they have the people who can actually implement these policies. And then I think we really need the private sector to step up, which we are starting to see, for example, in the hyperscalers and the investors. And therefore, we need economic policies that make it okay for investors to invest big amounts of money, which means we need certainty. And so to the extent that the administration and the Congress can really push for certainty on these economic policies in general, and then the specific nuclear policies, I think we're really poised to win.
Thanks, Judy. Todd, quickly, we are running out of time.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think we're going to see more from the Trump administration in support of nuclear. I'm sure many of us on this panel are aware of this, but I think there is likely to be one or more executive orders specifically focused on the nuclear industry moving forward. And my hot take on that is that being the transactional person that he is, I think the president is going to want to announce a significant deal when the first of those EOs is brought forward, and hopefully we'll start to see order books being built.
All right. John Kotek.
Yeah, and really, my head went the same place Todd and Amy's did, and frankly, I think that there's so many folks looking at so many different approaches to bringing new nuclear to market that I think when we do this panel next April, we'll be talking about multiple new orders on the books.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to finish by saying, Judy, you stole mine, but I do want to highlight one very particular part because I agree with you. This ANPI, or Advanced Nuclear Power for Installations proposal, it's fairly recent. It's the Army and the Air Force. I mean, they are talking about building 8 to 10 reactors, maybe even more, at defense installations around the U.S. and at strategic sites overseas. I mean, if you think about the government's role, right, we wouldn't have jet aviation if we didn't have this, we wouldn't have the 707 if we didn't have the B-52. And so I think that we're going to start to see more of that. And the government being sort of an eager lead customer for nuclear technology is really going to help drive things forward. It's not going to replace what the private sector and policy need to do, but it's definitely a driver. So with that, we're gonna wrap up our conversation. I want to thank each of you. I thought it was a great talk. I'm going to sort of plug it again. Monday, June 6th, 1 p.m. Central Time at the Chicago Downtown Marriott. We're going to have part 2 of this conversation live and in person. You can ask all of your questions. You can follow us down the hallways after the event is over. In the meantime, check out a library of content that we have on our website with other webinars like this. Follow us on social media, and I hope we've made your week a little bit brighter. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye all.
Thank you.